Welcome to another part of Chapter 3 of Security Planning. For today, we are going to look at Part 4 Continuity Strategies. Previously, we have looked at security policies and then also awareness program related to security policies. So for this one, we are going to look at what are the things that we need to look at to ensure that our business continues on in cases of an incident or perhaps some mishaps happening to our organization. For the first part, we are going to look at contingency planning. The reason we have contingency planning is that we make sure that whatever happens to our business or information asset, we have ample time to actually respond and react to those incidents. For example, let's say there is a natural disaster happening and then that natural disaster actually affect how we actually do business, or perhaps right now there is a pandemic of COVID-19. So with proper contingency planning beforehand, let's say we have been prepared, let's say emergencies like this do happen, then how do we actually continue business or perhaps continue to serve our customers and client during the time of emergency? And also, by having contingency planning, we could also perhaps beforehand or before things actually happen, we have properly assigned our people, our employee for certain duty of how to actually respond and how to actually react to certain incident so that our people actually have proper preparation and actually have the knowledge to how to actually react and respond during those times of emergency. And this also, remember that we have a reputation and a responsibility towards our client to ensure that whatever they have paid us or whatever they actually assign us to do when they actually approach our organization to do business, we can actually deliver it even during the state of emergency or during perhaps natural disaster or perhaps attacks from unknown hacker or attacker. So a proper contingency planning ensure that business can operate as usual whatever happens or whatever actually is falling upon our information asset and our business or perhaps even our nation. So when we talk about contingency planning, there are actually three plans related to contingency planning. So first of all, there will be incident response plans or IRP, business recovery plans or DRPs, and lastly, business continuity plans. So the primary functions of each of the plan is for the first one, IRP focuses on immediate response. So let's say if an attack escalates or is disastrous, the process changes to disaster recovery. So for example, we have IRP in the first place where perhaps there is a mild malware attack. Okay, but let's say our people or perhaps the malware escalated into a much more bigger attack and also perhaps affect a much more a large number of information asset, so we can actually escalate our IRP to DRP. And DRP typically focuses on restoring the systems after a disaster occur. So this disaster can be a malware attack, perhaps worms, viruses, or perhaps natural disaster and even war. And usually DRP is closely related to the BCP or business continuity plan, because business continuity plan we have it to actually make sure that let's say something happened or the damage is major or perhaps long term that could affect our business. So a BCP actually requires more than a simple restoration of information and information resource. we need to actually strategize to actually how to actually maintain the business, or perhaps maintain the information that we are trying to protect is there throughout these trying times. So remember, so firstly, IRP is focusing on immediate response, or perhaps the problem is not very major. It means that whatever we have on our team can immediately remedy the problem. And then let's say the problem escalate, or the problem could not be handled by perhaps the immediate response, or perhaps our teams are not capable, or just the problem is too major and too heavy, or perhaps hard to handle in a very short time. So there must be a proper contingency plan to make sure that whatever we are protecting can be restored, and perhaps business can then continue as usual after the incident occur. So remember, we have three types of planning: IRP for immediate response, the DRP, and the BCP is for a long term, or perhaps for a much more major incident. So to see the relationship between IRP, DRP, and BCP, we look at this contingency planning timeline. So usually an incident begins from the IRP perspective. So incident detection will detect, okay, how severe is an incident, and whether we have proper people or proper personnel to actually respond, and can actually the incident be remedied by our response team. And then there will be the incident reaction, and then the incident recovery. And the incident is resolved, operation restored, and the end of the RIP. And let's say the incident escalated and classified as a disaster. Okay, for example, for the first part, perhaps we have just a minor break of a malware. Okay, so our team actually respond to the malware attack, and then perhaps the malware is contained. Perhaps it's just affect one computer, and then that computer is isolated, and we can actually stop the malware from spreading. Okay, now let's see. We are not aware of the malware attack. The malware actually spreads into different department, different machine, and the machine perhaps is very critical and is needed by the operation of our business. So when we realize something happened, then perhaps it is too late. So by that, the IRP then escalated to a disaster recovery plan. So once the effect of the attack actually escalated to a much more larger scale, so we must actually look at it as a disaster. So we look at, let's say, a disaster recovery plan, whether we can actually restore operations at a primary site. So for example, let's say after the malware spread into a much larger area of our operation, then perhaps we can have a full system reboot in our organization. But in order to have that, the disaster recovery plan in the first place must actually consider, if this thing happen, where do we actually store our backup? Where can we actually have the hot side and the cold side? Okay, where can actually we have information or data that can be safely recovered back, and to have a full reboot of our system in case that disaster actually happens? Or do we have an alternative site to actually operate for that kind of incident that is considered as disaster? Because let's say this malware actually spreads into perhaps the whole building or the whole network. So do we actually prepare for that type of attack or that type of incident? Can we actually recover from that type of or that scale of a incident? So this is where disaster recovery planning comes into play. We need to actually see perhaps the most bad case scenario Worst case scenario, what could happen to our organization or our information asset? So we must actually remember in information assurance, we have to be proactive and reactive. So proactive means that we have to actually consider each and every scenario that could actually befall into our organization and our protected information asset. So by actually having a proactive approach, we actually can actually prepare for all types of disaster, or perhaps if let's say there is a system shutdown, or perhaps a major malware break, or perhaps a, a very major natural disaster happening. So we actually know how to actually respond to that type of incident. And usually DRP is closely related to business continuity planning because it is relying on both. So business continuity and disaster recovery actually comes together because business continuity is actually a continuity reaction. Let's say that disaster actually happened, and during perhaps the interval to actually recover from the disaster, how do we ensure there is a continuity of business? This is very important if let's say our data is much very relied upon by our client or customer. So how do we ensure that business is continue to operate during the recovery period? So we have to actually consider perhaps alternate site operations. Okay, and then how do we actually operate during the recovery period? Because okay, for example, let's say we are actually handling our clients money and we are actually a banking organization. Remember, if we are actually a banking organization, we could not actually afford to have a very long downtime. So let's say a malware actually infect some portion of our machine or our storage. So there must be a way to actually operate or perhaps have an alternate site operation. So we must actually consider perhaps daily backups or hourly backups to ensure that if anything happen, okay, we can actually just switch into the alternate site and our client to actually have the service that they always wanted without actually being disrupted by that incident. So these are the things that needs to be considered in business continuity and disaster recovery. We want to ensure that our downtime is actually acceptable by our client and we can actually bounce back after the incident. So for incident response, remember, is for small scale incident or can be easily recovered. For DRP is a much more larger scale incident, and for BCP to ensure that our business continue to operate during that time of disaster. So before the IRP, DRP, and the BCP, we must have a proper business impact analysis procedure that we actually plan beforehand. Before we actually have a proper IRP, DRP, and business continuity planning, we need to actually do the BIA. So the BIA actually identification of threats and attacks. So we identify possible threats that could happen to our asset. Of course, in order to actually identify the threats and attack, we need to actually list down our most prized asset, meaning asset that is actually critical to our organization. And then after that, we identify the threats and attacks that could actually fall into or affect our asset. Remember, this is actually normal procedure and normal exercise that actually I always give you from time to time, either in computer security subjects or any other security subjects. We must first do the threat assessment, and then usually it begins with the asset. Identify your most critical asset, identify the threats and attack, and then do a business unit analysis where you actually list down the cost of actually losing that asset. And then also, how could you afford to actually have a downtime or a loss of that asset? So if anything happens to the asset, what will it cost our organization? And then we need to also consider the scenario of successful attack, from the beginning of perhaps a minor type of impact up into the major or critical impact to the organization. And then we need to assess potential damage or loss if an attack is actually successful. And then we classify the planning. If, let's say, the attacks happen, certain damage actually we need to actually consider and actually remedy it. So what are the plans to actually react to those type of attack and from the damage? Could we actually bounce back from the damage? Could we actually operate from perhaps an alternate site? Or could we have a backup of that asset that we have lost or being affected by the incident? So after having considered the BIA, then we can actually form a proper IRP, the DRP, and the PCP. So these are actually the major steps in contingency planning that you need to consider, okay, to ensure that we have proper continuity of our business should anything happen to our protected asset. So now we elaborate or perhaps go into detail of incident response planning. So the first step in IRP is to actually have the incident planning. So incident planning, we actually organize our team and then we list down the type of responses with regard to the incident that could actually happen. So let's say we have an incident of malware detection. So we assign one team to actually handle malware attack or malware incident. So we ensure that we have a proper incident response team and we have team that can actually specialize in detecting that special or that particular incident. And then when we are actually organizing the team, we must ensure that we have the proper individuals needed to handle the system as the incident takes place. So this team must have proper knowledge of that incident and proper skills to actually perhaps contain the incident if it happens. And then we must have proper guideline for reacting and recovering from each type of incident. So let's say if there is natural disaster, how to actually respond, how to actually react to a natural disaster, and let's say in terms of data safety, we have another team to actually be responsible to actually safeguard the data, do backups, and do restoration. So the first part, incident planning, identify the team and responses. Second part in IRP is the actual incident detection. So once we have our team, so we must ensure that our team have proper detection methodology. So detection can come from help desk, means that perhaps the incident is reported by a client or a customer. So we must have proper team that is actually handling the help desk. And secondly, the detection can come from special software or hardware that is actually handling the incident or special type of incident. And then third, detection can come from trained personnel that we have actually assigned into the team earlier. And then they need to always have constant training to the personnel to quickly identify and classify the incident with regard to the team that they are assigned to. Because once attack is properly identified, the organized team earlier can respond and actually react to such incident. So this is very important. We must identify where can we actually detect the incident. These are the three factors that we can actually detect the incident from the help desk, the software and hardware, and from our people. And actually remember, we must have proper update of knowledge and proper training to our people that we have actually assigned so that they can actually have timely response and how to actually react to the incident once it is detected. After the incident have been detected, of course, the next step that we need to actually consider in the plan is to actually react. So basically, in the incident reaction plan, it consists of the action that can guide our organized team to actually how to stop the incident, how to actually mitigate the impact of the incident, meaning from the attack or from the incident, how do we actually can bounce back or perhaps recover from the attack. And then our team must be able to provide information for recovery from that incident. And also, in reacting to the incident, the action that must occur quickly is the first one, notification of the key personnel who will actually handle, who will actually notify the perhaps the customer, who can actually manage the response, okay, who can actually respond to that incident. And then of course, proper documentation of the incident. This is actually important if let's say there is perhaps insurance claims or perhaps they need to actually have further investigation. Where is the source of the incident came from? And then how do we actually respond from those type of attacks in the future should it happen again? So the documentation is very important to perhaps the investigating committee to look at what actually happens that causes the incident to happen in the first place, or where does it came from, and who actually is responsible, and who is actually could respond better in the future should the incident happen again. Another step from incident reaction is to actually contain the incident. So in incident containment strategies, first of all, they must identify the areas affected. So let's say a malware actually infect our machine. So once a malware attack is detected, we must actually have proper assessment. How, where do actually will the malware spread? And currently, where is it? So we need to assess the situation properly when we actually want to contain the attack. And then, where does the attack actually spread into? Where will it go? Okay, and which critical infrastructure with regard to our operation asset is actually could be affected by the incident. So by that, our team can stop the incident and attempt to recover control through a number of strategies. Perhaps we contain one area first that actually is affected by the attack or incident, and then properly perhaps seal off all the other area or perhaps network that could be affected by that incident. And let's say if it's a natural disaster, we can actually perhaps anticipate it from perhaps weather forecast. So we can actually move critical business operation from the would be possible affected area from that natural disaster. So this part is very important because we must actually estimate the areas that could be affected and how we actually could gain control or perhaps isolate the incident from affecting other part of our business operation. The next part is actually to recover from the incident. So recovery actually begins once the incident has been contained and controlled and actually you have again operational control to your asset and business operation. So the task incident recovery is actually first of all to identify human resources needed and launch them into action. Means that after the incident has happened, okay, do we still have resources to actually operate whatever that is affected by the previous incident? And then secondly, assess the damage from the incident. Okay, what happened, what causes it, perhaps how many asset that you have lost. Okay, you look at the logs. Okay, you perhaps look at the configuration, what causes it, and what is actually being saved, and what actually save your operation after the incident. And then thirdly, you repair the vulnerabilities and see through any shortcomings in your safeguarding procedures and restore the data and services of the affected system. So the last part in the IRP to have a proper damage assessment of the situation or incident. So in order to have damage assessment, we can have several sources of information to actually assess the damages. So the first thing that we could look into is the system logs and the intrusion detection logs and the configuration logs. These can actually be found usually on the system that we have installed or anything in terms of hardware and software record. And other than that, the next source of damage assessment is from actual documentation from the incident response team. So this can be actual detailed documentation from the team from the incident. So that's why in your team there must be someone who is actually documenting all the occurrences that happens during the incident. So we want to see what actually happens, who responded, who actually detected the incident, okay, and then what happens to the system, where is actually the backup coming from, where actually the attacks coming from, where actually the causes the incident. And then this evidence must be carefully collected, documented, and maintained to be acceptable in formal or informal proceedings. Remember, for attacks such as malware attacks, perhaps hacking attacks, DDoS attacks, for example, usually there is individuals responsible for it. And perhaps we actually caught that individual. So we want to actually prosecute that individual, okay, according to the law and prosecution procedures. So in order to do that, proper documentation and evidence must actually be there to support your prosecution. Because without proper prosecution and documentation of evidence, they might not be able to actually prosecute the perpetrators. And then we must remember individuals who assess the damages need to also have special training, perhaps in collecting evidence, in doing documentation of the damage assessment. So that's why when you are forming the team earlier, you must remember that your team must have a broad selection of individuals with special skills and actual uh, knowledge to handle each and every phases in the IRP. This is to ensure that you can properly respond and react when the incident happen, and perhaps know when to actually detect if, let's say, an incident could be escalated from perhaps just a minor incident to a much more major incident that requires further responses and further uh, continuity planning to ensure that your assets can actually be uh, response and return back to the operational status and business continuity accepted by your standard and accepted by the client. The second part in contingency planning is to have business operation. Now, before we continue, this is actually a good spot for you to have a rest before we continue further. In order to maintain business operation, there are very much 6 steps that you need to consider before you actually have proper contingency planning in terms of business operation. So for the first one, we need to identify mission critical system and application, followed by business impact analysis planning, business continuity planning, business disaster recovery planning, business liability insurance planning, and asset replacement insurance planning. So we look at this phase by phase in the next section. So for the first phase is to actually identify the mission critical systems and application. So a mission critical system is any part of our system that must continue to run to ensure that your business actually operates. And for that, you must understand first how your organization actually operates and do business. So for example, imagine you have a salespeople within your company that sells products directly to the customers. So the customers must submit the orders over the phone or in person, or perhaps through the system, and the salesperson then enter the order into the application connected to a backend database. So in this example, the mission critical elements for your business operation is first of all your salespeople, secondly the phone that you are using, third the application that you use to enter the data, fourth is the backend database to actually store the information of the transaction. And if let's say the customer is able to place their orders directly through a website or the app, okay, then the app could be also considered the mission critical element. So the importance here is determined by how an application or a system is being used. If its usage is critical to how you operate, then that is a mission critical system. So this is the first part. So if anything should happen to this system, is there backup to the system, or can the system be recovered if anything should happen to that critical system that you have identified? Now the second part, after you identify the mission critical system, you need to identify and make sure you have a proper business impact analysis planning. Remember, firstly, identify the critical system. Now identify the impact analysis should anything happen to that particular system. So you identify the impact of a sudden loss of that business function. So the impact is often quantified in a cost. Cost means that financial loss or monetary loss with regard to the critical system. So you need to actually use both direct costs and indirect costs to calculate the impact. Direct cost means that the immediate loss of sales perhaps or expenses if you lost a certain asset, and you need to actually recover from that loss. For indirect cost is related to the loss of perhaps the customer confidence or reputation. So these are the things you need to consider in the business impact analysis. Remember, first identify the critical asset or system. Now what is actually could incur to your organization in terms of direct costs and indirect costs. Now a proper BIA report must contain the findings of this BIA analysis. You should also include the BIA planning in the report. Is first of all the direct and indirect costs of certain incident happening. Secondly, the maximum acceptable outage. Should anything happen to the critical system, perhaps how many days or how many hours could you actually accept to have an outage to recover back. And then third, the materials or resources needed for recovery. So, should anything happen to the critical system that you have identified earlier, what is needed for recovery? For example, perhaps you need to have a backup site in order to operate should a fire happens to your current operational location. Or perhaps you can actually just reboot back your system from the cloud perhaps if anything could happen to the existing data in one location. So the materials that you could need for recovery should also be identified. So remember, in the BIA report, first, the direct and indirect costs. Secondly, the maximum acceptable outage, meaning how long can you stay uh, unoperational with regard to the incident. And third, what could actually cause the organization to actually recover back after the incident. So this is the second phase. So to elaborate further, in your BIA report, first of all, define the scope. For example, the scope is to examine the impact of loss of email, for example. Secondly, identify measurable objective. What is your aim for the report? So for example, you put in the report, the objective of the BIA report is to have the direct impact analysis of the loss of email services for one business day perhaps. And then also one of the other objective to have list out the indirect impact of the loss of email services for one business day. Or perhaps for 2 business day, 3 business day, and so on. Any objective that is measurable and accepted by your organization. Third, identify the mission critical business function and processes with regard to that asset that you are protecting. Because not all business functions and processes are mission critical. That's why the first step in the BIA is to actually identify the mission critical application and function to your business. And then the fourth one, you need to map the business function and processes to the IT system. Means that, let's say, for example, we have the sales process, and then what is the IT system with regard to your sale transaction. So if the BIA analyzes email services served by one email server, then the IT system is the email server, for example. So you need to identify the business function and the process, IT process related to a business function. Then you can actually identify what needs protecting and what is required to have a recovery later on should an incident happens. So this BIA documentation is very important because you need to convince the management to actually invest on a certain recovery methodology and resources should anything happen to your asset. And you need to actually explain further if this is not properly prepared and actually anticipated, what could cause to the organization should the actual attack happens. So this is a proactive steps in order to ensure that you can react if the incident actually happens. After you have properly documented the BIA previously, now the next one is to have the actual business continuity planning. So the BCP or the business continuity planning is to have the actual overall plan for emergency responses. So it actually identifies the critical system for an organization, including the acceptable downtime should an incident happen. So your BCP must include the BIA previously and also the disaster recovery plans for individual IT systems. It means that you identify previously the critical system. Now, in this business continuity planning, what you need to actually do in terms of the incident that is actually affecting the IT system with regard to the critical system that you identified or the critical business function that you identified earlier. The aim of the business continuity planning is to ensure that any critical operation to your organization continue to function during the incident or the disaster. So by having previously the BIA report as detailed as possible in terms of indirect costs, direct costs, okay, this will help to create a proper BCP. Because the BCP must include the steps that you can take for different phases of the disaster. Let's say disaster level 1. Okay, what is your reaction? Disaster level 2. What can you do? Disaster level 3. Okay, can you actually bounce back from that incident? And then the content of the phases is dependent on each unique disaster that you identified. That could actually befall into your information asset or perhaps your business process. So the BCP steps before the actual incident happen, of course, we must actually have this BCP prior to any incident because we need to actually anticipate what incident could possibly, okay, affect our business process and our asset. So the first of all, we must have proper analysis. Identify the scope of the BCP means what incident that could happen in the event that could happen with regard to certain business process or critical organization element that could actually be affected by that event. Identify key business areas. Which operation of business will be affected for certain incident. And then identify the critical function with regard to the business areas. Fourth, identify dependencies between key business areas and critical function. Let's say for purchasing. And then what are the functions that actually support your purchasing process? What database could actually be used for actually storing business purchasing information, for example. And then the second one is to have the solution design. What is the acceptable downtime for certain incident? And then create a proper plan to actually maintain operation with regard to the scope of the incident. Third, how to actually implement the solution. Fourth, testing the solution through simulation. And then fifth, maintain and improve whatever BCP steps that you have planned. Because this can actually must be maintained even if the disaster or incident did not happen to ensure that your personnel is properly trained and can adapt when that incident actually occur. So maintenance and improve the process is very important in the BCP. Remember, first identify the scope, meaning one specific incident. Okay, what could be from that specific incident, what will be the affected business areas and the critical function that will be affected from that incident. And then the solution design, how could you actually resolve from such incident? How do you implement the solution? How do you test? And then lastly, maintain and improve the process of business continuity planning. So of course, this is a cycle, and cycle always need to be repeated and maintained. So you need to decide how frequent will you have to maintain the planning even if the incident did not actually happen, because we need to anticipate and be prepared whether it could happen or not. Previously is pre-incident Now is, let's say, the incident happens. Now what must be done after the incident? So the incident, first of all, there must be a activation phase or notification phase. So the goal of this phase to actually have take steps to continue operation as you have planned. Because now your anticipated incident actually happens. Now how do you respond? How will you place your team? Will the team actually be there before the incident or during the incident? Where is the response team actually situated for every specific type of incident? So your team must be organized and ready to respond anytime for your anticipated incident. And then the second phase is the recovery phase. So you do the damage assessment, and then if there is any loss, you must take immediate step to actually recover the affected system. So the focus on the recovery phase is on the mission critical system. So remember, you have identified previously in your BIAs the mission critical system, meaning the system that is actually very important for your business to continue to operate. And then the next phase is the reconstitution phase. So this is where the organization returns to the normal operation. Now, if during the previous recovery phase you have any mission critical system that is still operation, now they can be normalized. For example, operation that is you have moved to alternate servers or alternate location, now you can actually normalize the operation to actually operate in a normal location. And then this is the time where you can return non-mission critical system to operation in this phase. Remember, recovery phase, just ensure that the mission critical systems are operational. Now the reconstitution phase, make sure that all other systems actually is recovered again to your normal operation. So these are the post-incident in the BCP phases. Now, as part of the BCP, you need to have a proper disaster recovery planning. So the DRP is the key component of the BCP earlier. It includes the details of what you need to actually do or what are the steps needed to actually recover from certain disaster. So basically, in the DRP, there are details necessary to respond immediately to a disaster. So in your DRP, which is part of the BCP, usually you must remember that the BCP has a wider scope than the DRP because the DRP is very detailed to a certain incident. So the BCP helps an organization to continue to operate while the DRP focuses on recovering one or more systems after a major failure. So the BCP is on top of the umbrella, the DRP is under it. So the DRP focuses on specific type of recovery options and procedures, while the BCP discusses a very general approach to the recovery. So the disaster recovery is actually part of the BCP. So in order to actually know what to do to actually recover from certain incident, so you have the disaster recovery planning specific to a business operation. To ensure that certain costs and liability are protected, now business usually must consider certain types of insurance planning. Usually, we must have a method of risk transference by outsourcing or purchasing insurance. So usually we have insurance because we want to transfer business liability and protect the organization from lawsuits. Let's say your data that you have there and you are storing it in the server, then that server you have a proper insured to protect whatever uh, in terms of hardware and software that you are using that have certain warranty of protection. So three primary types of business liability insurance. First of all, the general insurance. So the general insurance, this is where almost any organization will purchase. So this provides protection against injury claims and property damages. So this provides an overall umbrella of insurance covering most lawsuits, because usually we want to protect our customer and our people should anything happen, perhaps from negligence, or perhaps something that could happen in the building or in the physical area of our business. And then secondly is the professional protection. So this protects the company if an employee provides faulty or inaccurate advice. So this actually involved in terms of service delivery. So usually a company providing IT services to other companies may need this, because sometimes your employee might give certain errors, or they are actually negligent in actually delivering certain services. So by having professional liability insurance, you can actually be protected should that happen. Third is the product liability protection. So this protects your organization if the customer becomes injured because using your product. So let's say you have an app. Let's say the app is actually a navigational app. So let's say your navigational application actually points the client or users into the wrong direction and causes accident. So by having a product liability insurance, you can be protected from the claim, provided that you have proper steps that you have actually put into the software that you are selling. Because software malfunction could happen. By having this, you can actually be protected should anything happen. So 6, your business need to have the asset replacement insurance planning. So this insurance planning is to actually protect your asset from any damage, physical damage from a disaster or incident. This is usually with regard to natural disaster, fire, flood, or anything of nature that could affect your physical building or location. And usually you need to have this to protect the people, your client, your employee, or perhaps key officers. And also, if anything should happen to your physical location, okay, this insurance could actually replace the losses in terms of monetary value. So your organization will not actually incur so much loss from the incident because you are protected by this asset replacement insurance. One last thing that you need to consider to actually protect your organization, let's say after certain incident have happened, is to actually whether you want to involve law enforcement in the prosecution or the investigation of the incident. So usually you need law enforcement agency or perhaps the police if there is an actual violation of law that actually occurs with regard to your business. And also if a criminal act is actually happening that causes the incident to happen. So you need to ask yourself or your team, first of all, when should your organization get law enforcement involved? And then what level of law enforcement agency should be involved? Is it the local agency, state, or the federal? Depends on the scope of the incident that happens. And then you need to actually consider what could happen when law enforcement agency is actually involved in the investigation of the incident. So this is where you need to have a proper legal department in your organization actually considering the repercussion of involving actual law enforcement. So first we need to actually see the advantages of having a law enforcement agency involved in your investigation. So the advantages, the first one is that agencies might be actually well equipped to processing the evidence. So let's say you don't have a proper team or your team is not very knowledgeable in actually processing evidence. So you invite the law enforcement in to actually do the investigation. Secondly, in terms of convicting or prosecuting the suspect, so they have actual field experience in this thing. Third, agencies are well prepared to handle any warrants and subpoenas. Let's say they want to interrogate certain suspects or they want to enter certain premises to perform investigation or prosecution. So this is where you can actually involve law enforcement involvement. The fourth one, usually law enforcement skill at obtaining witness statement and information collection. So if your case actually involve all these requirements, then you can consider involving law enforcement agency in the investigation of your incident. Now, on another side, the disadvantages of actually involving law enforcement agency, first of all, once they are actually taking over or involved in the case, your organization loses complete control over the chain of event of investigation. And this could also result in your organization not hearing about the case for weeks or months. So you cannot actually do anything about it to the suspect or when you want to actually do prosecution. And usually, equipment vital to the organization's business may be tagged and as evidence and it will be kept for a very long time and you cannot actually use that particular equipment. So these are the advantages, but you must actually carefully weigh the advantage and the disadvantages with regard to a case context, because each of them have the advantage and disadvantages. So weigh your options carefully before you actually involve the law enforcement into your case or investigation of incident. So by that, we conclude chapter 3 on security planning. So basically on this part of security planning, contingency planning is very important and vital as part of security planning to ensure that your organization can react and respond after a certain security incident. And you need to have proper contingency planning to ensure that your business can continue as usual to your organization as well as to the client. So you must consider initially you have three phases: the IRP, the DRP, and the BCP to ensure that you have proper contingency planning to respond to incident and to continue to operate should the incident happen. So by that, I conclude chapter 3, security planning, and I will see you on the next chapter. So thank you very much, and I will see you again.